Greetings, everyone. It's the 22nd of February, and delighted to have you with us, Content Evolution NuWorld. I'm Kevin Clark, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mike McGuire. Mike, how are you?
Doing great. Looking forward to the conversation today.
All right, that's fantastic. And our guest is Jimei Casio. Jimei, tell us how to pronounce your name, all right? Because a lot of people look at it and, lots of variations. How close did I get?
You got pretty close, probably 80%, which is better than most people, frankly.
All right, so what is the right pronunciation?
First name is pronounced jamais, like
Jamais.
the French word for never. The short explanation is hippie parents.
Okay.
The last name is pronounced Casho.
Casho.
Yeah.
You know what? I have never actually heard it pronounced, so I'm glad I asked. All right.
It's an Italian name. I'm just sort of your generic Euromut type, and but I hated having a name like that. Jamais. Hated having that name growing up. I went by James for a long time, but as an adult, well, way past adult at this point, I love it because it is Google unique.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one else out there with that name.
Yeah, well, it's I'm delighted. Right, if I had gone on to a service, is there any service that pronounces your name correctly? Right, if I go on to, is there a pronunciation bot for the Wikipedia entry for you?
The first name is usually pronounced correctly because it is a real French word, so it's usually jamais. But I've gotten a variety of pronunciations for the last name. Usually it boils down to Casio, which is close enough. I'm not going to worry about it.
I mean, yeah, it visually looks like the Japanese watchmaker, right? And so the default is to that, but I like it. So delighted to have you with us, and
happy to be here.
You're going to unpack something you invented. How long ago? BANI is how old? What's its birth date?
Late 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I was asked to do it. I used to do a lot of work for an organization called the Institute for the Future. I'm a professional futurist. I've been doing this kind of stuff for over 25 years. And since between 2007 and last year, I was doing a lot of work with Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, which is a 55-year-old nonprofit, originally a spinoff from RAND back in the day, that looks at trying to help organizations of all sizes think in more functional and constructive ways about the future. So I've been doing a lot of work with them, and I was asked to give a talk at one of their big annual events on global chaos, in particular in relation to global power. And so I just giving a lot of thought, what do I want to talk about in chaos? And so this term VUCA has been around. It's been around for a long time. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's a term that, at least the origin story is it comes from the U.S. Army War College. I think there may be someone who came up with it before that. But U.S. Army War College in the late 80s, and because it was military jargon, business consultants loved it. And it got used to describe what the world looked like in the post-Cold War era. So volatile and uncertain, and that actually describes a point in time that the end of the Cold War, the beginnings of the internet is a big thing. Around that, the 90s into the early 2000s, like 9/11. So VUCA, useful term, but I first heard about it in the 90s when I worked at Global Business Network with Peter Schwartz and Stuart.
Sure, Napier Collins was on our board here, and you participated in the memoriam call for Napier, one of the great people on the planet. Yeah, great people.
I admired Napier more than any other person I've ever met.
Well, that's a big statement. But I would second, right, that he was, one of the most admirable people that I have known in my life.
Moment of silence. So I had heard about VUCA when I was
Mhm.
back at GBN. It's been around for a long time, and as we moved into the 2010s, late 2010s, and in particular a specific presidential election in 2016, I began to feel like VUCA was insufficient. That everything was VUCA. We were swimming through VUCA, and in parallel to a fish not knowing about what water is because they're swimming through it, everything is VUCA. It's really hard to distinguish what VUCA really means.
Mhm.
So just chewing on that, and it struck me that maybe we need to talk about something more profound. Well, more profound for me. It's just more, I
Mhm.
don't know, more. And so brittle is a term that I've done a lot of writing around resilience, and brittleness was a big part of that in that discussion. And brittle seemed to be a really useful term to think about the capacity of systems to appear strong, to act strong, to be strong until they hit a failure point and then failing swiftly. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. BANI, the A is anxiety or anxiety inducing. And that actually came from doing a lot of reading online from what millennials and Gen Z young people are feeling about their lives.
Mhm.
And just seeing how much just sheer anxiety and fear and depression was in the minds of people who are trying to wrestle with the world as it changes. And articulating anxiety here as meaning the inability to find a good answer, or a situation where there are no good answers, only gradations of bad answer. The feeling of you just missed your turn off on a highway and there's another 150 miles to go before the next exit. That kind of,
Mhm.
what do I do now? There are no good answers. Nonlinearity is the N, and that I was thinking in terms of climate. And climate is well known to be a nonlinear process, but in particular, there is an aspect of climate change that not a lot of people talk about. It's a hysteresis. That is, it's a lag between the input and output, or a disparity in scale between input and output. And with climate, there is a minimum of 5 years, up to 20 years lag between the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and a measurable change in temperature. And that goes both directions, by the way. So we would not see, we could stop putting any CO2 or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere right now, right this very second globally. And we would still see at least 5 years, probably closer to 10 or even more years of continued warming. It would be as if nothing, there was no result. We made all these changes to our lives and nothing happened. And I started thinking about the political consequence of a situation where where your actions don't have consequences for a decade. And just nonlinearity becoming a process that can lead to systems becoming brittle. And I'll talk in a minute about an example that I love to bring up. And then I is incomprehensibility. And that was really around AI and just our real inability to understand the thinking, or the thinking like processes that can lead to different conclusions and outputs from AI. And that was true back in 2018. Definitely even more true today. And I don't know if you saw the headline just yesterday about ChatGPT, for some people coming up with completely
Gibberish.
crazy output.
Yeah.
And the folks at OpenAI saying, "Oh, yeah, I don't know. We haven't changed it since January." And so, it's
And
that kind of situation.
It's ingesting its own hallucinations, and therefore it's hallucinating on the hallucinations in some cases.
Exactly.
I actually think
Exactly.
it's OpenAI's fully built on AT&T networks, because AT&T networks is now blown up today. So they forgot to pay their bill. That's all.
There you go.
On that particular issue, I was with Sam Altman yesterday at an event, and he brought that up and said that it actually was more of a glitch than it was anything planned. So
Oh, I didn't think it was planned, but
yeah.
a glitch is just sort of a polite way of saying we have no idea what happened.
Possibly, it does appear that they actually did understand what happened and they corrected it right away. So
That's right.
Okay.
But for $7 trillion, I can give you something better.
But so a situation where I saw these kinds of forces as being more applicable as a way of describing global chaos
Right.
than the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And frankly, I thought they were a lot more diverse of a set of
Mm-hmm.
descriptions, set of terms than VUCA. There's like a lot of overlap in the VUCA combination.
Mm-hmm.
But it was mostly
I want to ask you a question before you go. Didn't VUCA and UDA kind of start to emerge in the same era?
Yeah, they did. And I think they also had UDA also came out of the military
Exactly.
language.
It was, Pentagon, and it was documented in it was John Boyd in Robert Quorum's book, right? Boyd. And I was just thinking that VUCA had this companion, which is for all the things that happen in a VUCA world, here's a way to deal with it, right? Or these short cycle decisions, right? That UDA describes, right? So when we talk about BANI and as we're going forward, I'm wondering whether UDA is helpful or whether there's a parallel. Here's how you solve problems in a BANI world. So keep going.
There is, I would say, just as a quick aside, I think UDA is part of what led us to a BANI world, that idea of having short cycle responses.
Okay, cool.
All right. So just with all of this, I thought, oh, this is a really clever thing. And I did my talk for IFTF in 2018 and stuck it on a shelf. There was a lot of polite nodding and people who didn't seem to quite understand and people who did understand. And interestingly, and I should have seen this as an indicator, the people who really embraced it at the time of the talk were folks who were visiting from Brazil. And so 2019 passes, and when things with the pandemic start happening in 2020, somebody who had seen that talk said, "Hey, you should put that BANI talk up online somewhere because I think it's actually kind of relevant." So I turned that talk concept into a piece and I posted on Medium, and it exploded. It really just sort of became something that people were looking for. It turns out, especially in the developing world, especially in Brazil, initially in Brazil primarily, but really all over the developing world. It gives a name to what they were experiencing in a manner that VUCA, simple volatility and uncertainty, could not. And names have power. We give things names as a way of controlling them, really, but really to categorize, to see their extent, to see their limits, to see where they go. And the variety of terms that go into BANI really seem to hit just the right notes for people who are living in extremely chaotic parts of the world. Just as a note, in the subsequent years, in the 4 years subsequent to this, I put myself onto a Google alert. So for any use of the word BANI with my name or with VUCA, just to see how it's spreading. And I've gotten pings on BANI from throughout South and Southeast Asia, also China, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and Austria, but never any English-speaking countries. Interestingly enough, not one hit from the US, not one hit. Well, English-speaking aside from India. Caveat that. But some places have just embraced it, just really said, this is our language, this is what we need to, the terms we need to use. In Sri Lanka, the big university there, I can never pronounce its name correctly, the university there did an entire, something blanking on the term, still haven't had enough coffee, Did
Institute?
a symposium.
Okay.
Did an academic symposium on BANI. And
No.
they asked me to do a remote keynote for it. I've done multiple presentations in remotely for Brazil, a couple other countries in Central America, and for a group in Germany. It's really interesting to me to see how this has taken off, and it's nearly not every single time, but nearly always in a pairing with VUCA. Although I am just in the last 6 months seeing it increasingly used as a descriptor for the BANI world we're in now. In mostly Indian articles in Indian business journals, but it's taken on its life as its own term of art, and it's just a shock to me. Absolutely, I mean, it's something that I came up with to gratify myself, to to satisfy my own particular intellectual urges, and apparently it resonates. And so I've been reading what people are writing about it very closely, watching there are probably at least 10,000 videos on YouTube from other people and groups talking about BANI, which is, again, just kind of shocking to me. There have been some really good articles written about it in online in particular. There was a piece about it in the Vatican News. But really what it boils down to is it has become a term, it's used as a term to give a name to the panoply of chaos that we experience around us, all over the world. And in places that are much closer to the metal, who have less protection from their society against these forces of global chaos, they feel it particularly acutely. And so I've been trying to figure out what to do with all of this. I'm very happy to have it out there in the world, but what do I do? How do I make, should I even try to exert some steering for it? So it's a fascinating thing to watch from just sitting back and watching it, an objective perspective. It's surreal as all hell to be in the middle of it. And I'm always happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that it's clearly a meme that has a typology of cultural resonance, right? Because it has self-selected. It's probably a both and, Jemay, of both curating where it goes because you're the author of its existence, but then, like Dawkins, creating the term meme, right? At some point, he says, hold it, this is going in a direction I didn't intend, right? Blah, blah, blah. So I might just say as a hypothesis, right, for discussion is there's a difference between being and doing cultures, right? We happen to live in North America in a doing culture, right? Where, ready, fire, aim, right, is more of our, intentionality is we'd rather do something than plan. Many of the places that you're talking about have more being, culture underneath, which creates potentially some of the brittleness, right? Which is the first thing that they're reacting to, maybe. I don't know. We could have a longer discussion. I'm not going to try to unpack that, but I just throw it out for, for interest. We're going to go into discussion here.
May I interject something?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Jamais, not je, but jamais, I had this very similar experience, almost exactly what you're talking about with digital natives. It first showed up, I did it, it first showed up in Tasmania and then New Zealand, and now, and 20 years later, it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. So I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that, having gone through something similar.
Yeah,
that's outstanding. Actually, I've been starting to use the term AI natives.
I've used that as well. Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
But
that's because it's an extension, but it works well.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, the fact is if you say AI natives, all right, well, they're AI infant natives, right?
Right.
Because
They're just
for the most
born.
part, yeah, there are scientists that have been at it a lot longer, but for the most part, the people who are claiming to be experts now have expertise, right, that is measured in months. Okay, so I mean,
Yes,
you know,
they're very young, these AI
Well,
natives.
though, when you talk
Nobody's
about
grown up with it.
yeah.
when you use the term AI natives, I think of it a little bit of a different context in that that's more or less going to be what Gen Z is. Because we're doing quite a bit of work with the younger generation. In fact, I just hired a kid. Well, he's a kid. He's in college,
Mhm.
but he's like one of your perfect examples of a Gen Z uh, tech weirdo. I mean, this kid knows everything, and he's not even in our industry, which is why we're bringing him in. But you know, he's telling us more and more of what's going on the college campuses, on the high school campuses. And my son and I were talking about this yesterday. The whole question of using AI tools as a vehicle for study and, you know, education. Ben was funny because he said, heck, if I was back in college, I would be using it like crazy. And I'm the opposite of because I grew up, I'm in my 70s, so I go way back in the sense of schooling. And I've asked myself the same question, would I use AI if I was, doing that? Because in those days, the study methodologies were completely different.
Mhm.
But my point is, Mark, in responding to what you were just saying, the AI natives, it's going to be kind of interesting to track the Gen Z's role in this as they grow. Because in my case, we're being introduced at least to conversational AI at an older age, where they're going to be, that's going to be the way they do things.
Right.
Mhm.
Let me share a perspective on that. That a number of people have been calling the generation after that the alphas, and starting over again with the Greek alphabet. And I like that a lot because it indicates like a new world. And the people you're talking about, the Gen Zs, the college age kids now, are they're just coming up against this and saying, where is it useful? And there's only one place that it's been useful for them so far, which is in their academic work, and where it is extremely useful. And my
Right.
kid in high school started using it from day one. And otherwise, they're tending to ignore it. My kid is not into it. A lot of other people's kids are not into it. What's his name? Kyle's kids are not into it. But because there's no real good use for them other than that. But I think Gen Alpha will start to really find these uses, and they are going to be the true AI natives. And
Yeah,
we're the trend, we're the bridge.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
Right. I've been the way I've been thinking about it, and I work as a professional futurist. So in nearly every context where I use the concept of AI natives, it's in it's in the context of the mid 2030s, mid 2040s, where those people who may be really young now are actually, moving towards being young adults. But just what you were saying there, Mark, a moment ago, just struck me that what you're talking about is AI, just like the internet and digital tools were, generation earlier. Is AI a tool or an environment? For Gen Z, it's a tool that can be used or not used. For the Gen Alpha kids that are coming up with it surrounding them, it's having a responsive environment.
Yeah.
And they're
And
not
I look at it
necessarily going to
even a
think.
third way. I look at it a third way as an evolution, as a part of us. And so I think that we have a whole set of post-biological evolutions, of which this is a new one. And therefore, they're going to grow up with a new body part, essentially, or a new brain extension, or whatever you want to call it, that they're just starting to learn. They don't know, nobody knows how to use yet.
Right.
But they're going to all figure it out gradually as it comes up, and it clearly extends humans in certain areas in an enormous direction.
All right, so Mike, I'm glad you're here. What are you getting out of Jemai's BANI thesis?
Well, I think the perspective on the kind of the duality of or the dichotomy of the generation split between whether the perspective on it, whether it's a tool or an environment. And I was curious, Jemai, as you were going through your research over the years on this, I guess it's implicit. I just wanted to get clear on that part of the anxiety and the kind of sense of hysteresis you mentioned for a lot of, especially the Gen Alphas and I guess maybe even Gen X, is because of the expectations they've had from birth that all advanced technology is great. Their parents, their grandparents, and look at these advances that we've had. And to some degree, right, when you bring in the reality of climate change, I've been wondering if that's a sense of that despair, is that disconnect, right, between the great advances they've grown up with in technologies, and then all of a sudden this, truly existential threat that was probably largely caused by some of those advances in technology. I think, and there's an element in there too about their kind of overly measured lives, right? I mean, you're younger than I am, but I think we both remember a time in California when we were kids that, if it's the weekend or the summer, if it's after 9 o'clock in the morning, you better be outside and, just be home before sunset.
Right.
And not, and what did you accomplish, by the way, during that time? You were never asked, like,
right.
Did you get in trouble? Did you have some nice waves? Good. Never show me what you accomplished in the last, 8 hours.
Right. Right. Yeah. I grew up in California. I'm in my late 50s now. So I grew up just at the, where I grew up, I was in the middle of the smog alert.
Yep.
Centers in Southern California. So those of you who are not from around here or not, recently might not recall that back in the 70s, the air pollution in Southern California in particular was so bad that there would be an alert that would go out, a smog alert about how bad it is. And if it was a red alert, you were not allowed, as a school kid, you were not allowed to go outside to play. You had to sit very quietly in the darkened classroom because it was hard to breathe.
Yep.
And so, but just that context of being surrounded by a physical environment that was hostile to you, and yet we were given a lot more freedom as kids. But I just
during that time, I used to go into New York, and same problem, but it was concentrated. And I'd go in, and I was working for IBM early career. I'd go in with a white shirt, and I would come out of Manhattan with a gray shirt.
Yep.
With black around the collar. Go ahead.
No, just thinking the stuff that you were talking about, Mike, and as a Gen Xer, and think about what it was like for me growing up. I think that at least in the U.S., or maybe you can see people broadly to a Anglophonic West, in general, there has been this philia, this embrace of technology as being a great thing for a long time. And yet when I was growing up, it was the contrast between technology will save us, or technology is great, and nuclear war.
Right.
I would just started college when Ronald Reagan was was president, and that was an exciting time.
I was just getting out of college. So.
I started in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. But it was interesting you mentioned the smog alerts. I was born and raised in Northern California, but had my mom's side of the family was all in Santa Barbara and LA. And I do remember, when we had a couple of years ago, if you recall, we first started getting, because of all the fires, we were getting, the horrible air quality. And my wife grew up in Chicago, and I was like, boy, I do remember this sort of thing. And, but it wasn't in Northern California. It was the family in Southern California. And that notion again, where nuclear war is one thing, and now we can't go outside at all because of technology. But on the other hand, we also, we saw that break, right? That we came out of that with things like catalytic converters and, requirements for emissions in California, where
Right.
you could finally see, the San Gabriel Mountains, most of the time.
Well, I mean,
Okay, enough with the nostalgia.
we
Sorry
we
about
used to
that.
have
Keep
to
going.
do duck and cover in the Midwest,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it was either for nuclear preparation or tornadoes,
Tornadoes.
right?
Yeah,
And
duck
so
and cover
the
turned
kids
into
still do it
earthquake
for
for me.
tornadoes, right? But they're not thinking so much about nuclear war anymore. Maybe we're changing that, right?
I did it. I was under my desk in elementary school.
Yeah,
Yep.
same here.
Okay.
So, where I
Thanks,
was
Mike.
going with that, though, is that this disconnect, this tension between the potential that technologies have for us
Mhm.
and the dangers that they can present, that is a fairly, that's a multi-generational thing, and it will be interesting to see whether the dysphoria around AI that keeps bubbling up here and there. I wonder if that's going to become its own modality for fear around technology, around the world we live in, but potentially without the hope of a technology to save us. I don't know. It'll be interesting to watch. I actually just did a set of scenarios for a large NGO about life in 2045 that had that as one of the possible tensions, as the degree to which people see AI as being threatening and the degree to which they've integrated it into their lives in a way that is beneficial, that they perceive as beneficial.
And again, if I can interject here, one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about is that while the technology grows exponentially, and we all see all these capabilities, good and bad, that keep coming, our human capacity on the emotional side, our limbic brain side, isn't growing. And so therefore, then I think that's really increasing the tension because the gap is getting so much wider.
Well, it's not just that. It's not just that. It's that you have companies that have figured out that attacking that limbic brain, attacking the emotional centers of the brain, is a very useful direct path to profit.
Yes.
And so you have all of these companies that are essentially using digital technologies in a way to stimulate the parts of our brain that react most swiftly for good evolutionary reasons. Things
Yes.
around fear, things around anger, things around despair. Those react very quickly when stimulated, as compared to things around respect or happiness or being or generosity. Those take a little bit longer to get going.
Yeah.
Just in the sheer biology of it.
Yeah.
And so you have not just a disconnect, an increasing tension between the technology and the emotional side of, and the emotions in our brains, but a direct attack upon our brain, the emotional centers of our brains, as a way
I think that's
of
great. I see it
making a
all
lot
the
of
time.
money.
I see it all the
And
time now. That's video
yeah.
games. That's online gambling. That's a lot of this stuff.
It's
And
social media.
yeah, it's social media and all this kind of stuff. We really need to talk about this at some
Okay.
point.
Yeah.
So we'll set up a completely separate call for that topic because it's worth exploring. Mike, we'll noodle on whether there's
Yep.
a guest for that. So going back to core hypothesis here, it seems to me that BANI has a lot of similarities to Santa Fe Institute, a complex adaptive system theory, all right? On the, non-linearity is kind of like black swan stuff, right? Nassim, right, kind of world. I guess not much about anxiety, but brittle is clearly about fitness landscapes, right?
Okay.
That you're either adapting or you're not. And so, to the fact that you're reinforcing the way that you see the world, and you reinforce to the point where, oops, we're going out of business now. We're going to wink out of existence, right? It's a problem, right? So what's an example of an organization that you think has good BANI instincts? We could probably think of a lot of negative examples, but let's think about one that maybe, just has a good way of navigating, right, relative to the framework that you've brought into the world.
Ooh. That's a difficult question, in part because most of my contact with organizations has been through, either being a consulting type work. So basically, they're coming when they have problems, and so
let me
government of
suggest one
Singapore.
to you. Well,
Sorry, I was going to
I
suggest the
can
government of
suggest one
Singapore
to
might
you,
be a
but
good example.
if you've got an idea, go ahead and I'll share mine in a second.
I have done some work with the Risk and Horizon Scanning Group for the government of Singapore quite some time ago, so I can't speak to it in the last 5 years, but that was a small country that that knows that it has to be well aware of the risks and be able to move. There's an old term from martial arts training that I was told once, that if my opponent does not move, I do not move. If my opponent moves, I move first. And that's the approach that the government of Singapore has had to take with the world, of being really acutely aware of what's going on around it, to be able to make plans and policies externally focused or around resources that are meant, that allow it to continue to survive with being essentially a resource nil bit of land.
Right. I mean, if has moved from, being a place that has very few natural resources other than the humans that are there, which is quite rich, all right, because they've developed that. But they've become an attractive force for being a go-between, right, and a hub for a lot of different things. So another example from a place is, I think Estonia has done a remarkable job of being adaptive, right, and trying to move itself. And again, it's small, but it created this, what is it called? Is it e-citizenship or something or other? To basically say, otherwise you wouldn't be paying attention to us, but we can give you, all right, a passport to lots of interactions that you wouldn't have thought possible if you use us as a hub, right? I'm not sure that they're expecting people to move there as much as that, simply to be thought of as a conduit. Do you see, examples of that happening potentially in the world of enterprise or NGOs?
NGOs.
No? Okay.
I mean, there are a few that have. I don't know if I could really describe any particular NGO as being, something to give it as an example of a BANI successful organization. The companies that I can think of were more adaptive when they were smaller. And I'm just thinking about, for example, Apple between 2000 and let's call it 2010, the first decade, when it was still coming out of the period of, oh God, Gil Amelio. Yeah, and just I don't know. You guys probably remember all of the rumors about Sun buying Apple in the late 90s. And just all of these different, who's going to, wasn't there a wired cover that was Apple's
I'm going to bring in the subject matter expert here. Go ahead.
Well, the point being that in that first decade of recovery and there was a lot of experimentation and a willingness to try new things and adapt. That is, I think, harder to do as a $3 trillion company than it was as a however many hundreds of $1 million company they were then. And I think we can see a lot of places where companies that have been adaptive, been flexible, and have stumbled across a niche that they can dominate, get stuck in that and find it very difficult to move to something new, even as that curve is falling. And I wonder, for example, around NVIDIA. Suddenly, NVIDIA is the darling with its chips that are great for AI. And they're going all in on that. Well, at some point, that's not going to be a successful path forward. Are they going to have the capacity to see that, to recognize that that world is changing?
Their
and
business model feels brittle, okay, because it's not broad,
exactly.
it's very narrow, it's got its moment right now, and the question will be, can they pivot from their current positioning? All right, I was just on a to what they need to become. Go ahead, Tim.
But in NVIDIA's case, Jensen has pivoted 4 times already.
Yeah, I know.
And I know Jensen actually quite well. I knew him before he even started NVIDIA, and I've spent a lot of time with him over the years. And one of the things that and this is kind of just a twist on this, but going back to your Emilio days, I worked with Emilio during that transition period. And, he inherited an amazing problem from Spindler.
Yeah.
And he was the wrong guy to pull that off. And I know in that particular case, he was just trying to keep them from going under,
Right.
let alone driving direction. Which is why when he told me that he was going to hire Steve, I said, seriously? But he saw something we didn't. And you have to give him credit for, what he actually did, because he was proactive, even in the light of all of the incredible problems that were going on there. But going back to this NVIDIA thing, you're right in the sense that they've transitioned. But to be fair, he saw this from the beginning because of his focus on GPUs. And what he did is he just continued creating greater GPUs and convincing everybody, or telling everybody, that you just can't just use CPUs alone. You need to actually to take us to the next level of computing. And yes, he happens to be in a good position because of the AI issue. But my gut is and I know him well enough, he's not thinking of today. He's already thinking 2 years from now or 4 years from now.
Well,
So
good.
there's a transition issue, I think, at least in some of those examples, where at least in the context of some of these particular companies, they think much farther ahead. Like Apple, what they're doing right now in the metaverse stuff with their headset, that's 5 years out. Even though he's giving you something that gives you the vision of it, 5 years from now, we're going to look back and realize that was the future of computing.
Yeah.
That's entirely possible. Just you mentioning metaverse, I actually wearing my metaverse roadmap pullover that I got when I was back from the project that was funded by Elon University and the Pew Research back in 2007, I think. Yeah, so metaverse has been something that's been discussed for quite some time.
We have some
my
people
point in bringing up Apple and NVIDIA was not as so much to say these folks are doomed, but just saying that here's an example of companies that have gotten really big fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And in particular, you had with Apple, it was around the phone, where it just that became Apple, the phone company, even though, I'm on a Mac, some of you are probably on Macs as well. And that's been the risk for Apple of can they move to what's next? And they're certainly trying. NVIDIA just exploded with its stock price and all that around AI. And yeah, I've had NVIDIA GPUs in my gaming PCs for years. It just bumped up to a 3070. But as a GPU manufacturer, it was fine. And I don't think anybody thought of it as being a world changer until GPUs became synonymous with AI.
Yeah, I mean, it had to change role from rendering polygons to, a different task. And it's attracting investment across a whole whole new category of purpose optimized, right, machine learning and AI chips, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff, whole bunch of competitors that are lining up to try to take that market cap away from NVIDIA. It's become a target, right? And that's useful because there's a lot of thinking, a lot of capital is moving into the space, all right? And we're going to have fabs that we didn't think we even thought we wanted, right? In places that we didn't think they could exist, right? Beyond Taiwan, and South Korea real soon.
So I want to actually go to talk about something that I mentioned earlier that I would be getting to around brittleness. And that's guano, bird and bat poop.
Okay.
It turns out in the 19th century, guano was a massively important global resource. The original version of the agricultural revolution took place because of the use of guano as a fertilizer. And you had in the US, you had the Guano Islands Act of 1865, I think, that where it was promulgated that an American who comes across an uninhabited island that has guano resources, by default makes that an American territory. You had Peru and Spain fighting a war over the control of guano islands in the 1870s, 1880s. There were wars fought over the control of islands covered in bird shit because it made such a fantastic fertilizer. And then 10 years after the war, guano would become worthless because of the Haber-Bosch process of artificial nitrogen fixation and creation of artificial fertilizers. Suddenly, what had been one of the key global resources that people were spending, the governments and countries at the time were spending the functional equivalent of billions of dollars on, goes from that to worthless in less than a decade because of a technological transition. And so when we think about how massive NVIDIA is, and I'm just using this as an example, is how massive a company can be that's focused on something that's so profitable right now, that's no guarantee that it's going to remain the way things are done. It's going to make you all fuzzy and out of focus.
Your hands were in focus.
That's it. That's good. That's the important part. But where I'm going with this is that I like to use the guano story as an example of how brittleness can apply even to the biggest, seemingly most important resources around. And I just try to keep that. I tell people to keep that in mind as they're thinking about how much do they want their organization to specialize? How much do they want to specialize? Is there a potential for this thing that you've spent years and a bunch of years and a bunch of money on becoming functionally worthless overnight?
It's a good unjustified assumption story too, right? Because some of the things that we have as underpinning for the reality, what is real, all right, can shift pretty radically, all right, given new things entering into the picture, right, that you can either perceive or you can choose to actively ignore, all right, at your peril. Okay.
If you know about them. Yeah.
Right.
I know you have to have an active, awareness system, all right, to be able to see it, all right, and even if you see it, you may not know what you're looking at, right, or comprehend it, all right, which is part of your incomprehensible part of BANI, all right, is you want to move the incomprehensible to being comprehended at some rate of transition if you can.
So this is actually leads to talking, what I've been thinking about as the responses to, or how to live in a BANI in a BANI world.
Right.
And so in thinking about brittle environmental, let's talk about resilience. So how can we increase our flexibility, increase our extra, our overcapacity to be able to absorb, sudden shocks? I have heard, this is anecdotal. I don't have a,
Mhm.
research paper to back it up, but I've heard conversations about companies in California, the ones that were most prepared for an earthquake, did the best in dealing with COVID because they already had plans on, in mind or on paper about how to deal with suddenly not being able to have all their employees come in. As an example of how resilience can be an economy of scope, not just an economy of scale. With anxiety, I talk a lot about empathy,
Mhm.
and recognizing that someone else's behavior may seem antagonistic or pathological, but there are very likely reasons for that they're not expressing. And it sounds very, it's all get together and hug, but I mean that very sincerely, that we need to be in a period of extreme anxiety. We need to be able to forgive and have some, allow some grace, and basically recognize that everyone's going through some shit right now.
Mhm.
Right.
For nonlinearity, I'd think about improvisation, and I really do. I strongly encourage people who are trying to think about what do I do in the future, is actually take some improv acting classes to get in the mindset of how do I think on my feet, take what's given to me and then turn it into something new. Not
And one
just
of the key things
repeating a
underneath
checklist
that,
of responses.
yeah, one of the key things in improv that they teach you is the yes and,
Yes, and
Mm-hmm.
all right? And it's a positive framing to be able to say yes and this, all right, as opposed to no, all right, which shuts people down.
Yeah, the yes but is the risk that you always fall into, or I've seen people fall into around improv training, and
Well,
really trying to get people to move out of the but mindset into the and mindset.
right.
But the point is that one of my favorite
Out of the
definitions,
butt.
yes,
yeah.
One of my favorite definitions of intelligence is how you know what to do when you don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
That is, how can you take the information around you and turn that into a novel conclusion, an insight about the world, even if you don't have a checklist of steps that
Right.
apply in this situation. And so many of us are trapped around doing the things that we should do, doing the things that we're supposed to do, following the process that's been given, even when that process no longer truly applies. And so,
Education.
I'm sorry?
Well,
Education. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah. And so when I talk about here, how do we deal with nonlinear phenomena? Well, one thing is to actually take it as it stands and to respond to it as it is, as opposed to thinking about what it should be. And learning to think on your feet, learning to react appropriately in the moment. Incomprehensibility has always been kind of a bugbear. I'm not quite sure what the right response. The one that I had been talking about for a while was intuition, the gut feelings, and there's a book came out, The Gift of Fear, but just that the recognition that your brain can sometimes piece together elements of reality that don't necessarily make it to your conscious mind, but give you a strong feeling. And I love to use the example of God, I'm suddenly blanking on his name, the Soviet missile officer who
Uh,
God, he basically prevented World War III in 1984.
84, right.
Yeah, it was like a couple of weeks after the KAL 007 flight was shot down over Kamchatka, and he was monitoring a radar site, and he saw 5 incoming missiles from the US. And he knew that if he followed the checklist, if he followed what he was supposed to do, it would have gone up the chain and almost certainly automatically turned into a massive retaliation, massive response, and therefore a response from the US, and that would be the end.
Arkhipov.
But it didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right to him. So he held off. He waited, and it came through a few minutes later that it was clearly an error.
Yeah.
That was a glitch in the system. And simply by not following the rules that he was supposed to follow, because it didn't feel right. So I really like that example. I wish I could remember his name.
Arkhipov, Vasily, Arkipov.
No, I don't think so. I'll look it up as I'm talking here. But and the problem with intuition is it's been misused so much lately, or people, the QAnon types, the people who do their own research on Google, not feeling that that facts matter. And so I've been steering away from talking about intuition. But an alternative to intuition as a way of thinking about how do you deal with incomprehensibility is actually something that comes out of my old days at Global Business Network, and that is a diverse network or a diverse web of inputs.
Right.
One of the things that was really great about GBN in the way it did scenario projects and projects with its clients was that it would bring in a network of people that are not part of that industry, that are not part of that world, to be able to, because they could often, if you bring someone who's smart but not part of your industry, they can often have insights into what's happening, what are the processes that you don't have because you're so deeply immersed in it. Stanislav Petrov, yes, thank you. That's exactly it.
Google still kind of works. It's getting worse, but that stuff it still works for.
So you're really delving over into an area that's well documented in Dietrich Dorner's The Logic of Failure, right? Is that, people who aren't following their common, what we might call common sense, right, in the face of procedures, is why you get a nuclear meltdown, right? Or other things happen, is that you're just following the orders, or you're just looking at procedures, and you're not paying attention to what you would otherwise say, this doesn't feel right, right? Doesn't, we have lots of metaphors. Doesn't smell right, doesn't, doesn't look right, all right, blah, blah, blah. So
where I'm going with this is that with incomprehensible systems, and I sort of, and sometimes in my talks, I expand it out to talk about things that are senseless or unthinkable as being as part of this rubric of incomprehensibility, is that you need an alternative perspective on the reality to get a different insight, not necessarily a better insight, certainly not necessarily a complete insight, but it's something that's a new perspective that lets you see something else. I sometimes talk about scenarios and this kind of work in general as being an epiphany engine. That this is a methodology, these are ways of looking at the world from a new perspective that makes you say, aha, I never thought of it that way. And my prescribed or my suggested response to incomprehensibility is all around that, finding new perspectives.
But isn't incomprehensibility also simply the edge of, moving into the area of hypothesis for scientific method? They say, we don't know, right? And so we need to be able to push the envelope and find out more, right? Incomprehensibility is where we are right now in a lot of quantum physics, right? Is that it's not only incomprehensible, it's somewhat paradoxical, right? In the,
one of the important things about, and I see your point, and I agree with where you're going with that. And I would build on it by saying that one of the critical aspects of incomprehensibility in science, the hypothetical in science, is a willingness to be wrong.
Bingo.
And
I like it.
That's something that we see so often as being not part of the vocabulary of people who are in power, whether it's political or economic or social, is an ability to say, I was wrong, and mean it.
I'm going to add another word in there if I can. The word is yet. And this, a lot of people say we can't do this. I've heard people, this is not something that is going to be happening. And you always have to add yet, because most of what exists in the world wasn't possible at the time that it was thought about. And with the passage of time and human growth, it has become possible. So yet is a very important word there, I think.
Sure. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's a great substitute for the but that we were talking about a moment ago, because that always means that I'm about to say something that will contradict you. All right. It's a bright signal. Jamais,
Yes.
jamais, all right, if I'm pronouncing it right. Where would you like to take this nascent practice idea as we wrap up this call? Where do you want it to go from where it is today? We've talked about where it landed. It may not have landed in all the places that you'd like it to land. So where would you like to take it and have it land? Because people who listen to this, people who pay attention to these calls, could theoretically help you, all right, make a connection that's necessary for where you want to go. So give us some telos.
Well, I would like to see it become part of the vocabulary of change in the West.
Okay.
And just very broadly speaking, I would like to see it become part of the conversation as how we think about a chaotic world in the English-speaking world. And I'm not sure how to get that, how to do that, because this is so this all happened so organically. I did not expect, and I did not push for BANI to become a thing in Brazil and Mexico and Sri Lanka and India and blah, blah, blah. It just happened organically because people saw a resonance. People saw that there was something there that meant something to them, and that it articulated a feeling that they previously found inexpressible. I don't know, and I suspect that it's partly because it comes to, I'm going to cough here. It's partly because these are places that are experiencing a great deal of on-the-ground chaos in that moment. So Sri Lanka had just gone through a massive political corruption and economic corruption problem that they were still dealing with the aftermath of at the time of that symposium. Brazil was going through Bolsonaro. I have a sneaking suspicion that if Trump is reelected, BANI will become part of the American vocabulary. So I kind of don't want that to happen, I guess. But where I would like to see it go, I would like to see it continue to be part of the language. That's one of the things that's been most powerful for me in watching the use of BANI even without my own participation in it, is just how much it has become part of the language of the day. Just so many organizations and business consultants in India and just all over the place talking about the BANI world. I saw somebody, God, where was it? Vietnam. Someone was giving a speech at a graduation speech talking about, and you students are entering the BANI world, and going into a little bit about what it meant, but just that the fact that it was something that the speaker felt so comfortable with introducing to the students, the graduating students. And I love that, just from the sense of it feels good to have created something that means something to people, to have created something meaningful.
Right.
And I don't know if I can ever things can get better than that.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for being our guest. We will continue to look for ways to make BANI visible, useful, meaningful to people as a result of our time with you today. And what I'm going to be thinking about is it has good explanatory power. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time and get back to you on how does the diagnostic tool then become a way to suggest actions to take.
Right.
Right.
Right. I
Because,
appreciate that.
again, moving from a being culture to the action world, the doing culture, is I think that's the hook that would be necessary for BANI to be, embraced more widely, is that it's a shortcut to telling me what I should do.
Right. I will happily listen to any and all suggestions and critiques.
I'm going to give it some thought. I want all of you everybody who's listening, present and to the replay. All right. Give that some thought, and, give it to Dr. Kasha here, all right, when you are inspired, or I'll be glad to connect you. So with that, thanks for being with us. Any concluding remarks, Jimmy, before we stop?
Thank you for listening.
Oops.
Hey, that's one of the things about this, this whole situation is that I recognize that this is not complete, that this is not fully baked, and so I greatly appreciate critical comments as well as, plaudits. It's really useful for me to hear where I could be better. And so thank you for listening to me, and thank you if you have something to tell me about how this could be more useful or more functional.
Yeah. Or maybe we will have the perfect way to apply it, all right, because we discover something, all right, that we can refer to you.
Could be.
Again, thanks for being with us, everyone, and we will be with you next week. And everything you do, be intentional. Talk soon.
Thanks, Jamie. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you.